Quick disclaimer, this is an AI voice, which is not going to be perfect. There is a transcript in the description as well as subtitles for you to read along with. The executive is the branch of government responsible for implementing laws and policies with a structure that includes the Prime Minister, the Cabinet, junior ministers, and government departments, while its powers extend to royal prerogative, legislative initiation, and secondary legislation, alongside the principles of ministerial responsibility and the balance of power between the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, where factors such as ministerial select and policy influence illustrate the extent of control over events and policy. The executive is the branch of government responsible for implementing laws and policies, consisting of the Prime Minister, the Cabinet, and then government departments with key roles including proposing legislation and making policy decisions, while holding significant powers such as royal prerogative and legislative initiation. The structure of the government consists of the Prime Minister, the Cabinet, junior ministers, and government departments, where the Prime Minister leads the government. The Cabinet is made up of senior ministers who make key decisions, junior ministers support Cabinet members, and government departments implement policies. The Prime Minister is the head of government who oversees policy, represents the UK internationally, and appoints ministers. The Cabinet is a group of senior ministers, mainly heads of departments, who collectively make major policy decisions and coordinate government action. Junior ministers assist cabinet ministers by focusing on specific policy areas and helping to implement government decisions. Government departments are specialized administrative units responsible for carrying out policies in areas such as health, education, and defense. An example of different parts of the executive interacting is when the Home Secretary worked with the Chancellor to introduce funding for increased policing in the 2019 spending review. The main roles of the executive include proposing legislation, proposing a budget, and making policy decisions within laws and budgets. Proposing legislation involves drafting new laws or amendments which are then introduced to Parliament for debate and approval. Proposing a budget requires the government to present annual financial plans detailing public spending, taxation, and economic priorities. Making policy decisions within laws and budgets involves setting national priorities and implementing policies while staying within legal and financial constraints. An example of the executive fulfilling their role is the introduction of the 2023 Energy Bill, which set out measures for energy security and net zero commitments. The main powers of the executive include royal prerogative powers, the initiation of legislation, and secondary legislative power. Royal prerogative powers are historic powers exercised by ministers on behalf of the Crown, including appointing ministers, issuing passports, and deploying armed forces. The initiation of legislation allows the government to introduce bills in Parliament, giving them control over most of the legislative agenda. Secondary legislative power enables ministers to make regulations and rules under existing laws without needing full parliamentary approval. An example of these powers being used is the Prime Minister's use of the royal prerogative in 2018 to authorize airstrikes in Syria without parliamentary approval. The ministerial responsibility is the principle where government ministers are accountable for their actions and decisions either individually or collectively. Individual ministerial responsibility is the convention where a minister must take responsibility for their personal conduct, departmental decisions, and policy failures. An example of individual ministerial responsibility is the resignation of Amber Rudd as Home Secretary in 2018 after misleading Parliament over deportation targets in the Windrush scandal. Collective ministerial responsibility is the principle where all ministers must publicly support government decisions even if they personally disagree, and must resign if they cannot. An example of collective ministerial responsibility is the resignation of David Davis as Brexit Secretary in 2018 because he disagreed with Theresa May's Brexit plan. The Cabinet is a group of senior government ministers, usually heads of departments, who assist the Prime Minister in making decisions and formulating policies. The Prime Minister and the Cabinet have many powers that can affect the relationship between them, as well as events that occur and the policies that are introduced. Powers of the Prime Minister and the Cabinet include leading the executive branch, setting government policy, controlling the legislative agenda, and making key appointments. The Prime Minister leads the executive branch by directing government policy and decision-making. The Prime Minister sets government policy by outlining priorities and ensuring their implementation across departments. The Prime Minister controls the legislative agenda by deciding which policies and laws are prioritised in Parliament. The The Prime Minister makes key appointments by selecting ministers, senior civil servants, and other officials. The factors governing the Prime Minister's selection of ministers include political loyalty, experience, competence, party unity, representation, and media perception. Political loyalty affects selection as the Prime Minister chooses ministers who support their leadership and policies. Experience influences selection because ministers with a strong background in government or their field bring expertise to their roles. Competence is a factor as the Prime Minister seeks ministers who can effectively manage departments and implement policy. Party unity affects selection since appointing figures from different wings of the party helps maintain cohesion. Representation is considered because a diverse cabinet in terms of geography, gender, and background enhances public appeal. Media perception influences selection as appointing ministers with strong public approval helps maintain government credibility. An example of one of these factors affecting a Prime Minister's choice of ministers is when Theresa May appointed Boris Johnson as Foreign Secretary in 2016 to maintain party unity by including Brexit supporters in her government. The factors that affect the relationship between the cabinet and the Prime Minister include the Prime Minister's leadership style, the strength of the cabinet, party unity, media influence, and external events. The Prime Minister's leadership style affects the relationship because dominant leader may centralize power, while collaborative leader may share decision-making. The strength of the cabinet influences the relationship as a united and influential cabinet can limit the Prime Minister's authority. Party unity affects the relationship because divisions within the party can weaken the Prime Minister's control over the cabinet. Media influence plays a role as negative press coverage can pressure the Prime Minister and affect cabinet confidence. External events impact the relationship as crises, such as economic downturns or wars, can strengthen or weaken the Prime Minister's authority. An example of one of these factors affecting the relationship between the cabinet and the Prime Minister is when Margaret Thatcher's leadership was undermined in 1990 by cabinet resignations and internal opposition over the poll tax, leading to her resignation. The relationship between the cabinet and the Prime Minister has changed between 1983 and 2025, with leaders such as Margaret Thatcher centralising power, Tony Blair reducing cabinet influence through sofa government, and Boris Johnson facing cabinet resignations that weakened his authority in 2022. The power is balanced between the Prime Minister and the Cabinet through conventions that allow the Prime Minister to lead while requiring Cabinet consensus on major decisions. This is the case because while the Prime Minister has significant authority, they depend on Cabinet support to implement policies and maintain party unity. An example of the balance of power between the Prime Minister and the Cabinet is when John Major was forced to call a leadership contest in 1995 due to Cabinet discontent, showing the limits of a Prime Minister's authority. Margaret Thatcher exerted significant control over her cabinet by enforcing strict adherence to her policies, such as her dismissal of ministers who opposed her stance on Europe. However, she lost control in 1990 when cabinet colleagues saw her as having become too inflexible regarding unpopular policies, leading to her resignation. Thatcher's decisive action during the Falklands War in 1982 showcased her command over events, yet her inability to prevent the 1984-85 miners' strike highlighted lack of control over domestic unrest. Her implementation of free market policies, such as privatization, demonstrated firm control over policy direction, whereas the widespread opposition to the poll tax in 1990, which led to riots, revealed her loss of control over policy acceptance. Tony Blair maintained tight control over his cabinet, exemplified by close cooperation between the Prime Minister's office and the Cabinet Office to support the coordination and implementation of policy. However, he faced internal dissent over the Iraq War, leading to resignations. Blair's leadership during the Northern Ireland peace process demonstrated effective event management, while his inability to prevent mass protests against the Iraq War in 2003 showed a lack of control over public sentiment. His implementation of new labour reforms, such as introducing the minimum wage, highlighted policy control, whereas the backlash against tuition fee increases in 2004 indicated challenges in maintaining policy support. Boris Johnson asserted control over his cabinet by appointing loyalists to key positions to ensure alignment with his Brexit agenda. However, he faced significant resignations in 2022 due to disagreements over his leadership style and policy decisions. Johnson's decisive action to get Brexit done showcased his influence over events, yet his inability to manage the COVID-19 pandemic effectively, leading to high infection rates, revealed a lack of control over national crises. His push for the levelling up agenda demonstrated policy direction, while the controversy over lockdown parties, known as Partygate, undermined his policy credibility. Keir Starmer has centralised authority within his cabinet, exemplified by the dramatic centralisation of authority in the cabinet committee system. However, he has faced internal disputes within the Labour Party over welfare reforms, indicating challenges in maintaining unity. Starmer's response to the Israel-Hamas conflict in 2023, where he expressed support for Israel and condemned Hamas, showcased his stance on international events, yet his inability to prevent internal party criticism over this position highlighted a lack of control over party consensus. His plans to re-centralise power to ministers, starting with the abolition of HS England to increase democratic accountability, demonstrate policy control, while backlash over proposed welfare reforms indicates challenges in policy acceptance. Thank you for watching this video on the Prime Minister and the Executive. I'll see you in the next lesson.